on strategy in general. The principal morale elements. They are the skill of the commander, the experience and courage of the troops, and their patriotic spirit. The relative value of each cannot be universally established. It is hard enough to discuss their potential, and even more difficult to weigh them against each other. The wisest course is not to underrate any of them, a temptation to which human judgment, being fickle, often succumbs. It is far preferable to muster historical evidence of the unmistakable effectiveness of all three. Nevertheless, it is true that at this time the armies of practically all European states have reached a common level of discipline and training, to use a philosophic expression. Nevertheless, it is true that at this time the armies of practically all European states, this is like a couple hundred years ago, by the way, have reached a common level of discipline and training. Full stop. To use a philosophic expression, the conduct of war has developed in accordance with its natural laws. It has evolved methods that are common to most armies, and that no longer even allow the commander scope to employ special artifices, in the sense, for example, of Frederick the Great's oblique order of battle. It cannot be denied, therefore, that as things stand at present, proportionately greater scope is given to the troops' patriotic spirit and combat experience. A long period of peace may change this again. The troops' national feeling, enthusiasm, fanatical zeal, faith, and general temper is most apparent in mountain warfare, where every man, down to the individual soldier, is on his own. For this reason alone, mountainous areas constitute the terrain best suited for action by an armed populace. Efficiency, skill, and the tempered courage that wields the body of troops into a single mould will have their greatest scope in operations in open country. The commander's talents are given greatest scope in rough, hilly country mountains. The commander's talents are given greatest scope in rough, hilly country. Mountains allow him too little real command over his scattered units, and is unable to control them all. In open country, control is a simple matter and does not test his ability to the fullest. These obvious affinities should guide our planning, and that's the end of that chapter. The next chapter is actually pretty long, but just focusing on this one, I mean, it's basically, bear in mind it's been a while since I did the last section of this, but this is all from, I don't know what year it is, but it's just sort of past the Napoleonic period, so 1812, 1820, 1830, something around that sort of time. So he's talking more about horse and musket and cannon and cavalry and that sort of stuff, where military combat was slightly different. I mean, his comments about armed warfare in mountains, I think there's probably some sort of application into thinking about that, but it's not quite as it was due to sort of air power. I mean, you can be sat in the mountains, and it's really not just a case of a soldier's mettle, so to speak. It's, if they can be taken out with an airstrike, it's slightly different. But it's still interesting, in its essence. That it says the principal morale elements. So we're talking about morale. So this is the thing that sort of obviously stops troops from running away, but also allows them to perform better, and also allows them to perform above and beyond what they might ordinarily well have done. Morale is something that I've put a lot of thought into. I haven't really come up with any sort of major conclusions, but sort of, I quite often temper morale with, let's look at something almost randomly. we've got some hills and things here. I mean, I don't know what we can, I mean, they seem to be held up in these hills here. But what I was thinking, morale it's something that you can apply on a personal basis, and it's one of the reasons I use the word depression in with regards to the sort of hits that units can take. It's either, that they start off at 0 and they can get 1 depression, 2 depressions, but they could be disruptions, dispersions. I never really know what D to use, but depression always strikes me as being sort of key, because you can almost sort of understand if you're depressed, you might not want to do something, whereas if full of life, you can suddenly just be a bit perky and do something that you might not have done ordinarily. And the same thing goes in war, really, I think. And so what we're talking about is the principal morale elements. I mean, the skill of a commander, I mean, I'm not so sure really how that actually pans into, affecting morale, the principal morale elements, meaning the skill of a commander. And that seems, I mean, he even makes reference to Frederick the Great's oblique order of battle. I mean, I don't really see how that can be considered, a morale element, more a tactical element. But, I mean, a leader or a commander would, to some extent, spur morale on. If you felt that I think it was McCarthy, I'm not sure who it was that led the Incheon battle. He planned it, and I think there was a lot of sort of, his presence there really boosted morale. And I like to sort of think about these things. I mean, it mentions sort of, nevertheless, it is true that at this time the armies of practically all European states have reached a common level of discipline and training. So what he's talking about there is the way that well, I think what he's actually trying to say there is he's trying to say that that sort of rules out the benefits of the commander, because they can't really do anything that's not sort of doctrine. I think that's what he's trying to say, but again, it doesn't really sort of give me much scope into morale. But I think it's interesting that he's talking about all European states. Well, obviously we're not quite sort of, in that sort of period anymore when Napoleon was running around Europe, and that was what was happening. But needless to say, I mean, I think if you were to look at the skill of the commander in current warfare, you might sort of be forgiven for sort of thinking, well, I mean, what effect can that have? I mean, do these troops even know who their commanders are? Possibly they do, but I think that there's less of that. Now that everything's more automated and roboticized, and I just can't see it being. I think there might be trouble with that, but I don't really use in Warblog. I don't really use leaders so much, but when the leaders are in there, that the mechanics do actually work. But the other thing is, so it says the skill of the commander. So we've got leaders in there, so we can sort of maybe apply a bit of that. The experience and courage of the troops. Well, I tend to sort of amalgamate things of that nature into the actual values. So, for example, if this was if I wanted to actually say, well, this was a particular unit, and for some reason I knew that it was, it had a greater skill. Where was it saying? It had greater experience and greater courage. I would actually give it a 5 attack value. So it's not a separate value; it's integrated. So sometimes when troops are sort of, obviously low, have a low morale, I quite often reflect that with the with actual sort of numbers on the counter. I integrate that all, but obviously once you get over 50% depressions, you have to start rolling against morale, which is slightly different, but and that's not really affected by the sort of strength. So there's no separate morale factors in Warblog. And one of the reasons for that, it just becomes a bit more complex. And a lot of people like what they call, I think, micromanaging everything. But I don't really like that. And I like to keep it very simple so that, you can just get it done with, have a blast, and go on and do something else. So, but you know, I mean, this is you know, the actual whatever it is, his essay, Karl von Clausewitz, on strategy in general, and he's talking, you know, he's divided up a lot of things. If you've read some of the other if you've listened to some of the other videos that I've made, you know, this is just one section of the greater thing, and it's a very short one, in fact. The next one's going to be quite a lot longer, so you know, there's not a lot here to be working with or to be thinking about. But you know, so we've covered the sort of the skill of the commander, which we detailed. We can actually have, we do have it. Actually have commanders in here. I'm not even going to try and find any. I've got a few somewhere, but I don't know where they are. I hate that when I feel compelled. Palmyra. I'm sure I had let's just do Pal. Dum, dum, da, dum. Oh look, there you go. First time lucky. There's a leader. So he adds some strength. So we got him sort of adding to the morale. So their morale, they will, if they don't have to start checking for morale until they're at least got 6 depressions, not 5. But going through his list, so we've got the skill of the commander. Well, we've covered that in there, but you know, talking generally about that. He seems to be relating it more to tactics as opposed to the skill of the commander as an effect on morale and a principal element or principal morale element. The experience and courage of the troops, which in this case is sort of, you know, so these actually, you can see this is an infantry unit, is worth 1, 2, 3. Well, there's probably a sort of good reason for that. They're designed to be quite weak, and the one thing I would say about this is this is pre-irregular time. You know, I didn't have irregular units when I did this, so that's why they're like that. But the last one is their patriotic spirit, and again, you know, if they were highly patriotic, I would give them just, you know, a greater defence factor or a greater attack and defence. I mean, I have done that before in some of the African wars, where they were particularly zealous and to a large extent on drugs. So those are it says those are the, you know, it basically says the principal morale elements: the skill of the commander, the experience and courage of the troops, and their patriotic spirit. And so I'm not sure really what more to sort of try and read into that, and in particular, you know, sort of how that relates to Warblog and whether those are relevant things. But I think morale is something that, I mean, I think in real war, it is something that has a serious effect. For example, if the morale of the British troops at D-Day was particularly low, they might not have wanted to do what they did. I mean, getting out of a boat in the face of a wall of, you know, enemy gunfire, storming up a beach, you've got to really be, you know, into it. You've got to really be up for it, really, you know, go for it. And I quite often think, you know, in the modern state of the United Kingdom, for example, would the people actually have the patriotic spirit to do that same thing today? And I don't think they would. I think that if you actually had anything that required the rising up of the people in support of their nation, in that sense, they would be twittering away about how wrong it all was. And there are other things that would happen I don't even want to mention here. You know, but I just think that the same is true for many countries, and in particular, I mean, there's probably, you know, true for a lot of other countries, but in Yugoslavia, when they called up their troops, a lot of them just didn't bother turning up. You know, they didn't have that patriotic spirit, and they did a lot of. I can never remember who was on whose side in those sorts of wars, or what's the difference between Yugoslavia and all the other names, and because they seem to have a few different wars in those sorts of places. But anyway, they had to fight their wars with mercenaries, basically bolstered with what they could muster from their populace. Even in Syria, a lot of the people that were fighting were mercenaries. It's interesting, really, because Syria didn't. I don't really know much about it, but Syria didn't really. It didn't have a lot of troops to call up on, but they hadn't actually enabled forced conscription, I don't believe. I just don't really know much about exactly what's happening in Syria, so it's quite strange, really, considering how much time I spend reading about it. But just from memory, I just remember reading something about how Assad hadn't actually, people weren't being forced to there were no forced conscription, so their whole army was based on volunteers, and I think that the paid elements. And a lot of that comes down to a mixture of, paid elements with support from the Russians in particular with their air power, and to some extent, and I'm not sure how intense it is, the Iranians, and also the support. And I know this is more the case in Iraq, where they had the popular mobilization units and a lot of other basically militias that were fighting on behalf of the government. So these might have been soldiers that might have been called up, but they're certainly not got the patriotic spirit to fight for Iraq. They're now part of their own militia, presumably have their own power base in wherever it is. And a lot of these militias if we look at this map, always makes me laugh. This one, I've never played it. You'd have to be insane. But these brown ones are the Syrian army, but all these other ones. Who's this? These are rebels. So these are Shuhada Atari Brigade. But these ones out here they're rebels as well. Who's this? Rebels. Rebels. I'm sure they were rebels. There you go, Syria. So the Basaj infantry. We got here the Bath brigades, and I think I don't know. Maybe I have to correct if I'm wrong. But the Bath brigades were not part of the Syrian army. They were sort of their own militia. Bath brigades. Syria, the YPG. Now they're a separate entity in their own right, and they've just given up that enclave. That enclave is actually only just fallen by surrender because of the Turkish Afrin operations. But the thing is, when you read in the context of this sort of chapter, the principle of morale elements and the patriotic spirit, Syria didn't have it. And it's not really a criticism on Syria in the same way that I don't think England has it. It would at face value and on the label it does, but that's because we've never been pushed to demonstrate that, where Syria was, and that's what's happened. A lot of these people have just formed their own militias and they'll fight with the Syrian government because they really don't want these rebels from winning. But so that's sort of how a lot of that has happened, and so and I think there's, I think this concept of morale is slightly sort of, it's difficult to sort of talk about without including anything else, because it's not talking, there's a lot of politics that go into it, but morale is sort of like something in particular, and I don't really think that this article really sort of, in the examples, it says it talks about the skill of the commander. Well, the skill of the commander, I wouldn't say really has a lot to do with morale, other than confidence. If you're confident your commander is really good. So, for example, in the Iran-Iraq war, you might have almost considered, well, how much did the skill of the commanders, because a lot of the commanders on the Iranian side were they were just put in there because of religious decision making, and you sort of think, oh, how will that actually affect morale? But also on the Iraqi side, a lot of the commanders were in there is because they were relatives or had familial connections, or were just networked their way in there. Had absolutely no military experience, and I don't know how that would actually push how it would sort of materialize in the context of morale. But it also says that the experience and the courage of troops, and I think experience and courage are actually two very different things, because you can have courage, you can have a lot of stupid people with a lot of courage, and they become quite experienced and no longer have the courage. I mean, I'm not saying that it's true, but experience and courage are not the same thing. So you could say there are four things: you've got to have the experience and the courage. But they he's put it together in a sort of a verbal narrative, really, which is fair enough. It was 200 years ago. But experience, I mean, we're talking about experience now, and a lot of commentary is talking about how experienced the Syrian and Iraqi armies are. And I think there's a lot to say about that. I think people do change when they become experienced. I think that the inevitability of death, once you get familiar with that, it should have some sort of effect, in the sense that people sort of, once they get past that, they're less scared and probably more accepting, and probably looking forward to that part of it than a lot of people otherwise are. But with experience, I mean, it's like that scene in Apocalypse Now where you have the commander standing up and saying that Charlie don't surf, and I can remember when I watched that years and years ago, and I don't want to say it's realistic or anything, but I think from what I've so much been thinking about, but the way my perspective has changed on that was, if you were to have a conflict like they had there, where they just landed by a river embankment that looks a bit like a beach, by helicopters, and they're attacking a town, it feels like there's bullets going absolutely everywhere, and the people without the experience, all the sort of GIs are sort of lying down, taking cover, they really don't want to get shot. But the commander, I think I'm not saying this is, because this is just my own personal opinion on a film, and it's fictional, but I think he's more aware of the fact that there aren't actually as many bullets flying around as you might imagine, and this slow awareness that everyone on the battlefield is probably holding down. It's the same sort of psychology in these spaghetti westerns where they walk down the street and there are people firing at them. Their experience is such that they know that the other people can't actually fire accurately at the range that they've got, and I mean, I know it's just more fantasy, but I think with experience you get this sort of general understanding of actually what's happening, and it's the same with a lot of other walks of life, which involve conflict and violence and risk to life. Is you become a little more familiar with how it works, and it's not so alarming. So and I think with experienced troops, that could have a major factor, because if you're in an armoured personnel carrier and you start getting sort of inbound fire on the side of the vehicle, imagine inexperienced troops might become quite scared. But I mean, if you're experienced, you're not going to be scared about that at all, because you're going to be used to it, and you know quite clearly that there's nothing that's going to affect you. I mean, other than a massive explosion, but those things are sort of, again, the experienced person will know that it's just the fear. It's probably quite unlikely. I mean, it could happen. If it does, it's just tough. It's the same sort of. I think it's the same sort of thing. I mean, I'm talking generally here, but you see films where people are shooting at each other, and they seem to sort of take it in turns. And I think that, again, there's something that, in sort of conflict of that nature, you have a lot of things that are, applied, involve applied experience in sort of knowing when your enemy has fired their rounds, and have a great understanding of how they're thinking and how they're feeling. So much so that if they fired 3 rounds, you could probably pop your head out and start firing back, because they have had enough courage to pop their head out and fire 3 rounds, but they're not going to sit there and keep their head popped out in case someone's aiming at them, sort of thing. And I think it's things like that that sort of make a little bit of a difference. And it's not so much, we're talking actually about experience and courage, as things that are slightly separate to what I would call morale. But it's the same sort of thing. I mean, if you don't have that experience, you're probably likely to find that you become sort of, your morale will fall. And you're sort of thinking, well, what is morale? Is not courage. Morale is not experience. Morale is not capability. So how can you relate that to actually what we're talking about here? But I think, generally speaking, they are interconnected. And again, I think another sort of key, possibly, example of what that means and how that works is the way that a lot of these African combat units use marijuana and drugs before they go into battle to improve their morale, and they just feel invulnerable. And it's the same sort of sense of courage and some of these African warlords would go into combat naked with just a knife, and they were just so hyped up, but they were so familiar, their experience with combat was so great. If you're going up against people that just don't have that same experience, you can almost walk around like the commander in Apocalypse Now, aware that there is, if you're only up against 5 people, they're not going to be firing 1 million bullets per second in every inch of space. They're probably quite likely to miss you because they're scared. It's just understanding, I think, the sort of the statistical chances as opposed to sort of a green veteran. But the thing is, how do you sort of relate that to morale and actually understanding? I think the thing to do would be to sort of actually understand what morale is. I would define morale as being something along the lines of a degree of willingness in a certain person that would range from one extreme to another. So so you're essentially not really necessarily talking just about the experience and the courage of a particular person. Well, not so much the courage. You're not just talking about the experience, but so you had one person and he has a defined range, and that will go down. So you can have someone that is really confident and they're quite capable, and they're ready and willing to do something. They might be attacking a heavily defended position, and then something will happen, a change will happen for that person to then become suddenly despondent and not be able to move forward anymore, and will only be wanting to move backwards. And I'm thinking a lot about that Hamburger Hill film, really, where they're sort of running up the hill. The amount of effort and energy it takes to sort of get up out of wherever little position they got with defence to stagger, a few yards forward up a very steep hill against, a determined defensive enemy. It's sort of like, you have to sort of have a degree of morale. And I think, what is morale? It's not just about the things that this is actually talking about. It's just the way a person feels. But if you've got a person that would be running away, but the will of their commander is such that they can't. And it also talks about here. Let me just find it. Yeah, the efficiency, skill, and tempered courage that employs that welds the body of troops into a single mould will have their greatest scope in open country. Now, I think he's talking more about troops that are in line, you know, and I think you can almost envisage it more if you think about that type of line warfare where you're actually walking in line and have people shooting at you. Again, you know, your experience will allow you to sort of understand and take on board the fact that, you know, at a particular range they probably can't shoot you. Chances of you being hit is quite small, but you know that it's talking about the weld of bodies, the courage that welds the body of troops into a single mould, and I think that morale as well can be. It's something that is, I probably haven't really sort of got a handle on fully in what I said just in this last sort of you know narrative dialogue, so to speak. But I think you can, if you think of other things like a football match or you know, what I get a lot of experience with is a lot of drunken people chanting songs, and you know. You get a sense, you can actually sense the atmosphere, and you can sense the sort of, you know, they're actually probably capable of doing things they wouldn't do otherwise. And I'm not talking about beating people up, you know, I mean, this whole thing that means that a group of people can walk around the streets just singing strange songs really loudly, and quite often they do that. I just listen to them from time to time, and you realise that any one of those people on their own wouldn't be able to sing so broadly and loudly and so confidently if they were on their own. They would feel like an idiot. And you could say, well, is that a morale? Do they have such morale, you know, based, you know, on their, you know, on the people that they're with, their fellow soldiers? And, you know, I mean, who starts the singing? I mean, would you say that there was a leader amongst them sort of saying, okay, well, we're going to, who starts the singing, and people are confident enough to follow them? You know, people don't follow just anyone. I mean, if I started singing, I think most people would sort of like smirk and try and find other friends, you know. But so a lot of what we're talking about here, I think, can be seen in other analogies. But just asking, you know, what morale is and how it actually works is quite interesting. I mean, this is a very short paragraph, the principal morale elements. And I think it's got so much scope because, you know, I think a lot of people, they just give elements a morale factor. If you look at war games, that's, oh, they've got a morale of this. And to be quite honest, it becomes a mechanical thing that I don't think, you know, has a lot of, that doesn't have a lot of sort of meaning behind it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Quite often, you know, in World War II, the SS units will have, you know, enhanced morale. In Napoleonics, the Napoleon's Guard, Old Guard, would have, you know, almost invincible morale. You know, Spanish troops would have sort of like, you know, very low morale, and Italian tanks would have, you know, lots would have a reverse morale, etc., etc. But the thing is, these are just numbers, and you sort of think, well, what actually is morale? You know, I mean, can you boost morale by giving everyone a bottle of whiskey the night before the battle, or perhaps during the battle? You know, is that how these things are catered for? I mean, you could take very green, inexperienced troops and artificially boost their morale so much that they would just never give up. You know, it's not really just, you know, a conception of only the very best will you know, experience great morale, and I don't think it's necessarily always a case that the same people will always have the same morale. I mean, it could be that you can have people that ordinarily, might be cautious, but given a certain set of situations, perhaps some sort of rousing songs, they might, behave very differently. I think it's interesting, and I'm just trying to sort of think really about how it affects modern war, and through the conduit of War Blog, and I think one of the things that it's making me think about is the difference between the more asynchronous and the synchronous type scenarios. So what I'm sort of trying to get to here, if ever, I think it's going slow now, doesn't matter really, didn't need to look at this, but if we look at one of these, for example, let's look at this one. I just did this, the Battle of Karbala. These American troops, you say, well, I don't want to be rude, but I would have thought, do they have a lot of morale? Maybe, maybe not. What about the Iraqis? Well, the Iraqis probably have a higher morale, but they're probably easier to break because they're not stupid. And compare that to the performance of ISIS units. I don't think I've got too many examples. I'm trying to think of the one where the American units take a city. I think it's Idlib. I wonder if my thinking is correct. Idlib. Yeah, this one, I think. No. No, let's look at that. It's another one that has, I'm pretty sure has some Americans in it. And the thing that I'm sort of getting to is that, well, even the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, and the ISIS, Islamic State, and all their sort of families, they, the morale, they don't have this sort of experience, the capability that the morale has to be, you could say it is a lot higher because they are more fanatical. And so you could sort of say, well, what is the spirit and the morale of, say, the American Marine? And I don't want to get too political about this, but I'm just trying to sort of put it in a contrast. If they were sort of dumped out of their plane, they would probably, the rhetoric and what we were told probably say one thing, but I'm pretty sure that they would probably pretty scared, and I'm not sure that basically what I'm trying to get to here is a lot of the highly mechanized Western nations, their soldiers in particular. It's probably better to think about the Iraqis and the Syrians in this instance, really, because they didn't have the zeal and the morale to fight ISIS and the militants at the beginning of their civil wars. They didn't want to do it. And what I gathered was that when they were finally galvanized to sort of start mobilizing against them, they only did it really when they had superior firepower. They only did it when they started to get some tanks in and some armoured vehicles. So, and I think that, you could say, well, their morale is pretty low. And it's not so much their morale is pretty low. Perhaps their courage and is just sort of, if you could say, well, that's a factor on morale. They weren't going up against ISIS without that. They weren't sort of, getting into their own techniques and fighting street to street on comparable terms. For example, I've just done this scenario here, Arnaba, and the interesting thing about this is you've got Hayat Tahrir al-Sham versus Syrian Liberation Front, and they're basically both irregulars. They're both foot-mounted. I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming that they are in this example. And it's a very different type of battle where that probably things like metal and spirit are probably a lot more relevant. Whereas, when the Syrian tankers come along, they're fairly confident. They're just sitting there firing their artillery and their high explosives and things like that. And again, I'm not trying to sort of cut them down or anything like that, but I think it's, when you start to sort of look at these principal morale elements, there's a lot to be sort of gauged in looking at those sorts of things. I don't want to say that the Syrian army would run away a lot sooner, but that they have to go in force so heavily. I mean, for example, we maybe sort of criticise the Americans, but the same sort of analogy or the same perspective angle can be brought against the Turkish army at the moment in Afrin. They're going in there and they're the brave and noble Turkish army. Well, that's fine, but they've got all the equipment. They've got air support. They've got long-range artillery. They've got lots of clever things that the Kurds there don't have. But the Kurds are putting up probably quite a stoic resistance, armed with, coupled with things like, these anti-tank missile launchers. And again, there's a little example really, because I mean, the presence of these technicalities, which I think to some extent probably would not have been such a factor. I mean, for example, if I can't remember his name, Karl von Clausewitz. I mean, I would have thought maybe that he could have included technical capacity in with the principal elements of morale. So he's got the skill of the commanders, the experience and courage of the troops, and their patriotic spirit. But he could have put in their armaments. I mean, these people are fighting, and they're probably fighting with a little more zeal and a little more relish when they've got anti-tank guns, because they can then take their videos and they can sing their songs, and they can feel as though they can defeat what is essentially undefeatable. I mean, I've looked at a couple of pictures of some of these American tanks as they went into Baghdad, and it's very apparent that just because people are taking out tanks these days, I mean, the average person cannot take out a tank. I mean, a tank would probably drive around completely uncontested, by anything at all, other than a military force. You couldn't drive a forklift truck into it. You couldn't drive an articulated lorry into it. You couldn't hit it with a hammer. You couldn't, these things are invincible. It must be like going up against Terminator droids. They have massive firepower. But, give them the anti-tank missiles, and all of a sudden, their morale probably goes up. Now, it's the same thing as having a proper commander. So, I don't know. I mean, I just think that it's an important element, and I think it's critical and fundamental in understanding how things work. Because, if you look at how Mosul fell, it didn't fall because Daesh or the Islamic State or Al Qaeda, I think it was, were so good. It fell because probably you could say because the morale of the Iraqi army was just too low. I mean, I don't want to say it quite like that because I'm not exactly sure why. It could be that they were just poorly organised. They were just surprised. But I think it basically came down to the fact that they just ran away because they thought they were going to lose. And I think you say, well, was that a morale failure, or was it just a failure of capability? Was it something else? But things like that, where these religiously, fired up militants probably, had such, a high spirit when they approached, and that nothing could stop them. And I think to some extent, it's another part of how I consider the perception of morale to be. And again, if you were to look at, say, a bunch of people out after the pub, singing their songs, walking through the streets. It's a bit like, actually, let's get another one which we can maybe refer to. What is this? It's in Yemen, south of Yemen. What's that place in the south? Yes, let's go for this first. Basically, it's Mad Mitch. He plays his I can't even. Yeah, I've got it. Down here somewhere. Aden. The Aden emergency. No, it's not that one. Anyway, it's the same place. The Battle of the Crater. I think it's that one, actually. Let's go for Crater. Yeah. So basically, what I was saying is this concept of morale as a sort of projection of a person's will. And I spoke about this a little in the other video, I think, about how geese and swans and pigeons, they charge at each other, and they have this sort of force field of energy that the other geese will run away from, and then the other geese will stop, and the other one will charge back, and the other one will run away. It's not one is bigger and stronger. They have a force around them, and it's invisible, and you can't really define it. And it's the same with, say, a group of people that are, full of this sort of like psychic positive energy that pervades everyone in front of them, to sort of somehow give up. And I don't think you can really claim this as a mathematical fact, but you can see it demonstrated especially in some of the Iranian offensives in the Iran-Iraq war, where they just felt that their religious zeal would basically result in them winning. But I think you can actually see exactly the same thing in Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, whereas they just they just build up such a force of will that would the Union actually think, oh my God, this is terrifying. We can feel these people marching towards us, and run away. I mean, they couldn't have been just sitting there sort of thinking, they're going to all be shot before they get here. Which is the obvious sort of thing. But here we have Mad Mitch, who's in here. There we go, Mad Mitch, and he basically takes his troops up here, and he marches them down Main Street, playing his bagpipes, and the troops surrender. And I think it's sort of like an element of morale, an element of the spirit of an army, so to speak, and whether that's slightly different. But anyway, I think I'll leave it at that, because I just wanted to sort of have a little blast on this. So it's been a while since I've done one of these, and hopefully I'll do a few more. And it was only, to be quite honest, it's probably one of the shortest chapters in the book, and I've made a real meal out of it. And whether I've done it properly, I don't know, but I just wanted to talk about it. But the next one is military virtues of the army, and that's a big one, but I'm still not going to spend much more than this talking about it. But so we'll see how that sort of all fits together, really. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'm just really trying to sort of explore this Claude von Schultz's work in the context of modern warfare, through the sort of war blog as a medium for sort of looking at that. I'm not sure whether there are any sort of it's sort of something that you can say, well, there's a lot to be learned from there. I just think it's one of these things that it's like talking about it raises thoughts about certain things, and that's the way that you can develop awareness and learn and consider things and think about things and realize things that you wouldn't be able to do anyway. I mean, so what I'm saying is there's sort of no actual sort of purpose in having the conversation or the dialogue, but in having the dialogue you then suddenly discover something. You think, hang on, wow, that's quite interesting. I mean, for example, it's just a little example. I don't think it's earth-breaking, but we went through his 3 principal elements of morale, but without considering armaments as a singular factor on that. And perhaps it is. Perhaps we can consider that. And perhaps other people have done more comprehensive and more solid, efforts on morale, and actually even have a definition of what morale is, because I don't think he defines what morale is in that dialogue, and I definitely don't think the things he talks about actually affect morale. So I mean, even if going away and thinking, well, what is morale, is the thing that's on your mind, then it's done its purpose, really, because I think considering what morale actually is would be the thing to actually go away and do, because I don't think that it does it very well. And then sort of coming up with sort of and anecdotes and examples of how morale is effective in comparable situations where I think one of the things that I was thinking in the back of my mind there when I was going through it all was the how do we find this? Falklands. This is what they do here. They go down to Goose Green. It's at Darwin under there. But the para, they do a similar thing. Basically, they do 3 charges against heavily defended Argentinian positions, and they sort of, from the narrative I read, they were sort of almost on the verge of giving up. Because obviously they've made 3 charges and failed, and they're having a rest. They're pinned down, and the Argentinians just give up. And it's you can sort of say, well, that morale. I mean, the way I saw it, the Argentinians seriously outnumbered the British. They should have won, in the numbers game. But and you could say, well, there's a lot to do with experience, because I think a lot of the troops that the Argentinians had were raw recruits, whereas the troops that the British were using were experienced men. But that's not effectively a morale issue. That's not exactly just down to morale. Morale is something else. But being able to hold up after having 3 attacks and being pinned down, losing probably quite a few men. I don't know how many they did lose. And then for the Argentinians to actually then surrender. I think that is a sort of a morale example. It's an example of morale, effective morale, and I think that's a start. But that this is sort of, well, that would come down to I'll put the book to a side now, but that would come down to sort of experience having an implicit effect on morale, but it doesn't actually define what morale is and how morale is affected. At what point do experienced troops surrender? What point do troops with high morale, what you might define as high morale values, surrender? At what point do they do that, and what are the factors on that, as opposed to low value morale units in comparison to, say, the outlying potentials of sort of green troops having exceptional morale through strange, twerks of fate, and highly experienced troops giving up at a drop of a hat. Are these morale factors that interchangeable? And how do you sort of define that and get your head around it all? Anyway, I'll leave it at that. It's been almost mad really. 54 minutes of me talking about something I don't know much about. But I'm looking forward to the next chapter, and I had to get through this chapter to get through that chapter. But I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and looking forward to the next one. I'll speak to you later. Cheers, mate.